today for questions and answers, but I think I will have some time also for some interactive moments within the session tonight as well. I'm hoping that this is about an hour long. And one of the things that I would like for you to be thinking about is something that you will take away from the lecture. So you might want to take notes if you would like to do that, because I'm hoping to have a chance for you to share either in the chat eventually a takeaway or two that you can take with you and try out in some of your relationships. You know, the Department of Applied Communication at UA Little Rock, our mission is to foster the co-creation of better social worlds through positive communication. And that mission is consistent with what we're talking about tonight. It's consistent with both creating and maintaining ethical communication practices, which value other people. And it's also consistent with being willing to interrupt narratives or stories which lead us to conflicts that are long lasting and harmful. So as we go forward and look at this, our mission is very consistent with the information that we're going to be covering tonight. I'm Dr. April Chatham-Carpenter. I'm the department chair of the UA Little Rock Department of Applied Communication. I'm also a professor, and I've been actively involved in recent years in efforts to help bridge the political divide by focusing on the communication that takes place in our relationships. So tonight, we're going to be talking about strategies that we can all be using to increase our conversational receptiveness in divided political times. Now, conversational receptiveness is not a term that I use a whole lot, except when I'm teaching or writing about this kind of work. And so let me define what I mean by that. It's our willingness to be curious, to be open, to learn about and from persons that we disagree with. This is really difficult in our kind of political divided times right now. But we're going to be talking about some strategies that can actually increase the likelihood of that conversational receptiveness. So tonight, I'm going to overview the problem that I believe that we're facing in our society today with polarization. We're going to spend some time kind of looking inward at our own tendencies towards that. And we're also going to spend some time talking about some potential communication strategies that we can use to deal with this polarization, both in our self-talk as well as our relationship with others. So when we take a look at this, think about why is it that we're talking about this topic tonight. I think all of us would probably agree that we've been facing some difficult political and relational times in which people are pitted against each other without even getting to know one another. You know, it's a time of what Amanda Ripley calls in her new book. It's actually called by this title. The book is called High Conflict. It's a time in which we're experiencing high conflict. Let me define how she defines that. It's when we are thinking in binary terms. We're thinking of good versus evil. We're thinking of us versus them. And we're looking at one side as being superior to another side. And when we think about the other sides or people that are different from us, we have heightened emotions about them. So much so that we call them. We call them the other. We demonize them. We dehumanize them. And when we do that, our field of vision really narrows, and it narrows towards our views and beliefs and towards our own kind of echo chambers of who we listen to. And it really it rejects the opposite or opposing different kinds of views. And what this does is it's very magnetic. And I really believe it's what has caused extremists on all of the extremists on all at the ends of the political spectrum to come about, because we actually are just unwilling to even work with the enemy, the people that are very different from us. So Ripley says when conflict escalates past a certain point, the conflict itself takes over. the original facts and forces that led to the dispute fade into the background, and the us versus them dynamic takes over. And she talks about that. And I think about, what originally caused the conflict in the first place. Actually, we even forget about that because it is just so hard for us to think about the other person in a way that we can even engage at all. Another term that's used in the literature is affective polarization. And affective polarization, as it's defined in the political communication and political science literature, is the extent to which individuals favor members of their own group and they dislike members of opposing groups. So we think about this really clearly as we see in groups, that would be my group, and out groups, the people that are different from us. And what happens with affective polarization is that we attribute good motives to people that are in our own group, that self-serving bias in attributions. And we attribute negative motives to people that are outside of our group. So that's also happening at the same time that we're being polarized or kind of being pushed apart from each other, those emotions we're experiencing. And then lastly, we have to think about these two things: high conflict and affective polarization impact our relationships. They impact our willingness to even develop relationships with strangers. They also lead to broken relationships in our families. As we get ready to go into the Thanksgiving holidays, you may dread the conversation that you could have at the dinner table with family members because they are a different side of the political aisle than you are. We have a lack of trust of each other. We don't trust each other's sources of facts, the interpretations of those facts. And we've already seen in our country that this leads to violence. So that's why we're here tonight talking about these kinds of things. Robert Staines, in a 2014, wrote an article that's entitled "Repairing the Breach." It's published in the Journal of Public Deliberation. And I'm going to put a couple of quotes from him on the screen, but I'm going to read one first before I put the quote on the screen that I'm going to read out loud as well. He says, "We have no shortage of broken communities in our country. Municipalities, workplaces, communities of faith, even families are torn apart by disputes and misunderstandings about gender, race, politics, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and religion, among other things. There's a great need of healing. When the common ground cracks and the gulf between people grows, they often retreat to fortresses of certainty." I love this imagery here. You can think about your own self with people who are considered maybe out-group from you, that you don't, they may be strangers to you. In these castles, the inside walls are black and white, and the narrow, clouded windows that overlook the chasm distort the light, admitting only a partial view. The drawbridge is raised so the other can be vilified and the purity of us can be preached. Meanwhile, the chasm widens, it deepens and fills with trash, old tires, garbage, industrial waste. The only things that grow in the breach are weeds, thick, tall weeds with woody stems and spiky blades that leave you bleeding if you attempt to cross. Venturing there, attempting direct connection, is too painful. It's much easier to stay in the castle and deepen the story of them and us. Now, I'll tell you, when I read things like that, I think, yeah, probably that's true of me. Even though I've been part of an organization called Braver Angels that kind of tries to address these kinds of things, even though I'm teaching currently a class on listening and civil dialogue, I still face these things. And my guess is you potentially do as well. He goes on to say, this isn't on the screen, but I'm going to read it anyway. "Families, organizations, and communities captured by this dynamic can be wounded and paralyzed for years, locked in a dance of avoidance and acrimony, silence and screaming, afraid to walk in the weeds, devoid of hope for anything better." So we have a need for civil dialogue. And we have power. And one of the reasons why I love the mission statement of my department is that it recognizes that we have power to work with others to form and maintain and build relationships. And we have the power with our language and our choices to do that. So we have to think about what is civil dialogue, first of all, when we're thinking about this. Well, dialogue, I think, is easy to define. It's the conversation, it's the discourse between two or more people that happen. Civil has a little bit more difficult, it's a more difficult term, because if you think about civilizations, it comes from that. And it's really kind of what makes us able to work together as human beings and not just kill each other off. Civil comes from being polite and courteous, but it's so much more than that. It's really about humanizing the other person and really caring about them as a person. There's a book called Beyond Civility that you could pick up if you're interested in more of the academic literature on civility. It's written by William Keith and Robert Danish. And they talk about civility as being one way of enacting communication ethics. So let me define civility from their perspective. They talk about 3 different types of civility. And I think you'll see kind of the type that we're going to be talking about tonight as we move forward. But weak civility is not what we're talking about tonight. That is just etiquette. That's politeness norms. It's socially expected behaviors. That's used to create comfort, belonging. You're fitting in. It's that kind of professional communication behaviors in some ways is what that would be, without ever addressing injustices that might be present in the world. Then you have strong civility, kind of on the other end of the continuum, and that's according to Keith and Danish, that's a network of behaviors and norms that can be used to actually engage differences in a way that deepens a sense of community. So it could be deliberation, it could be deep listening, confrontation, could even be protest and civil disobedience, because if there's a need to address injustices, there's a need also for doing it in a way that we can respect the other, but still call for change. The last type of civility that they talk about is pseudo civility. And I think about this because I see this sometimes happening. And it's where you're using politeness norms as a way to correct strong civility behaviors. You're saying to another person, you can't speak out for that, because that's being that's just not being polite. So you're actually correcting the ability to speak out for something in a way to make changes. So what I like about their view of civility is that they address the notion that civility can be weaponized. It can actually be used to silence dissent and to put others in their place. So we have to recognize when we're talking about civil dialogue that we're not talking about putting people in their place. We're actually talking about actually creating an environment in which we're working and using communication to build on and help us have relationships that are healthy and to have communities that can work together towards change. But they recognize that we oftentimes will have these competing obligations between the need to stand up for justice and the desire to work with others to affect change. Now, I don't have time within this hour to go into the part of civility that is that part that is standing up for justice. So we're going to only deal with that side of civility that is building relationships and care and humanizing the other in what we're talking about tonight. All right, so how do we become the type of person that's willing to be involved in strong civility? I want to tie this back to a couple of concepts, one of which I've already defined for you, which is conversational receptiveness. And again, conversational receptiveness is our willingness to engage with the other. It's approaching a conversation with a person that might be like a stranger to us because we don't understand why they're coming at certain things in certain ways. It's that willingness to address them and actually come with open hands and an open heart with them, and then becoming willing to listen to them and take their perspective, even though we may not agree with it. So that's conversational receptiveness. The more we do this and they're willing to embrace entering into uncomfortable conversations with people who are different than us, the more we can build up our muscles in conflict resilience. And I think about it, I kind of just like this, do this muscle. It takes muscles to sit within that discomfort of sitting across from someone that we don't agree with, that we don't understand, and trying to actually listen to their story. Burdone in a 2018 article talks about conflict resilience as the ability to sit with and be fully present around those with whom we have fundamentally different views on critical issues. He says, when we sit in the presence of others with whom we may disagree strongly, but with whom we can maintain civility and curiosity, we inevitably discover areas of shared interest and connection. And so sitting with conflict, it's not taming conflict. It's not pretending it's not there. It's actually discussing that conflict openly, acknowledging that we're having some tension and internal challenge kind of inside of ourselves to be able to think about it. But it's also refusing to let different views become this kind of force that pushes us apart from each other. Now, we think about conversational receptiveness and conflict resilience. We can think about this in terms of different communication contexts. And I like to think about this in terms of contexts that we study in our department. So intrapersonal communication is one of those contexts. It's that communication within ourselves. It's what we say to ourselves about the people that are different than us. It's what keeps us sometimes from engaging in conversation. It's what keeps us afterwards, makes us think about we don't even like that person. That's that intrapersonal self-talk. We also have to practice conversational receptiveness and build up our conflict resilience within our own group. Those are the places where we tend to make fun of the other side. We get involved in this kind of tribalism where it's like, this is our tribe, you're another tribe. We build that drawbridge up that Staines was talking about, and we're like, we don't want you. We don't want you as part of our castle. We don't want you as part of our lives. And so that's a lot of receptiveness that needs to be worked on even within our own group. And then, of course, with the out group or the other. So basically, what often happens is we have to depolarize within before we can communicate well with the other. So I have a little self-assessment that we're going to do together. This is actually from a nonprofit organization that I work with called Braver Angels, and it's from their Depolarizing Within workshop. And so if you have a piece of paper or something you could write on, I'm going to ask you 6 questions, 5 of them on the first slide, and then the 6th one is on the second slide here. And the question answer options are often, sometimes, and never. Okay. So here are the questions. How often do I find myself thinking about those people on the other political side without much regard for the variation among them? Often, sometimes, or never. Second question, how often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group and mainly positive motives to my group? Often, sometimes, or never. Third question, how often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how any reasonable person could even remain in that group? Often, sometimes, or never. Fourth, how often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side with the best people on my side? Often, sometimes, or never. And the last one on this page is, how often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side? Often, sometimes, or never. Now, I don't know about you, but I have more often and sometimes on my list than I would like to have. And if that's true of you, then you can take something away from tonight. If it's not true of you, then you can think about what have you done that actually has helped you depolarize, because you probably have done some things. All right, the last question is from a graphic, actually, from Dr. Bill Doherty. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota, also a marriage and family therapist. He also is one of the co-founders of that nonprofit that I was mentioning that the survey's from, Braver Angels. And he actually asked this last question. And if you look at on that red half circle, there are 5 emotions there: hatred, disdain, pity, basic respect, and appreciation. And I want you to answer this question about choosing one of those 5 emotions. Which of the following, which of those emotions, those 5 emotions, is closest to your overall emotional attitude towards the majority of people who support the other side? Which of those emotions is closest to your overall emotional attitude towards the majority of people who support the other side? All right, I'm not going to have time for you to really reflect on these. If you took the Depolarizing Within workshop, they would give you options to actually talk about it and kind of what you learned from it. But no, we don't have time for that tonight. But I want you to think about some reasons why you might be so polarized if you did answer the often and sometimes, or had maybe one of the 2 bottom 3 of the on that graphic. So Dr. Bill Doherty actually adapted John Gottman's work on the 4 horsemen of relational apocalypse. Some of you may be familiar with that work. John Gottman has a whole body of research in which he can almost predict divorce by listening to people talk to each other in conflict situations. And Bill Doherty took those 4 horsemen of the relational apocalypse and actually changed some of them and came up with 4 horsemen of polarization. And these are things that actually cause us to be magnetized away from people who are different than us. Stereotyping is the first one. That's where we group people into categories without getting to know them. I think most of us probably know what stereotyping is and what all of these are. Dismissing is the second one, and that's where we choose to only listen to or learn about our perspective. We actually are not willing to listen to or learn about the perspective of the other because it is just not worth our time. Dismissing. Ridiculing. We literally are making fun of the other side, often within our own group. And contempt, where we actually have outright hostility, leading to possible hatred towards the other group. And you can kind of see, if you move down through those things, they are kind of building on each other. We start stereotyping, so we don't see people as individuals. We start dismissing anybody who comes with those opinions. Then it's like we just think none of that's important, or it's just all crazy. So we make fun of it. And then we don't have any reason to have relationships because we don't like you at all. Okay. So how do we get out of this? How do we get out of those polarizing cycles and patterns and away from those 4 horsemen of polarization? You know, Brene Brown in her work talks a lot about storytelling and the stories that we tell each other. Well, one of the key things that we have to do is to re-story the other, to edit the story we are telling of the other. To do that, we've got to be in a place where we're willing to treat people as individual human beings and realize that they are more than just the enemy. They have many, many more identities than just that one stereotype that we are putting them in. And that we were reacting against. You know, this is consistent with the literature on intergroup contact theory, that the more we get to know people on the other side, the more we're likely to quit stereotyping them and attributing the negative motives to them. And if we do edit the story, this allows us to be willing to take the perspective. We mentioned perspective taking earlier. It allows us to take the time to listen to their stories, or we need to have active listening to actually edit the stories. And we need to identify where it is that we have something in common. I heard a person speak once that it's any conversation with any person is worth it if there's even 10 or 20% of my humanness that I have in common with them. And most of us can find, 10% of values that we can agree with them. But we have to have a learning conversation in order to do that. So I'm going to show you an example of a time in which that actually happened in Ohio. So me just make sure I have my settings on where you can hear my computer. All right.
This part of Ohio is southwestern Ohio, and it's in between the metro area of Cincinnati and Dayton. So there's a lot of rural and suburban areas, depending on what part of the county you're in.
Factories have been closing down left and right. So I've seen a lot of forced retirements, a lot of forced layoffs. Once some people get through the layoffs, sometimes they are able to come back. A lot of times they weren't.
I've had the door slammed in my face. I've had people say very rude things about Obama and ask if I voted for him. And some people would say, hey, you're not going to lie to me, go ahead and put your sign in the yard. And other people would say, get out of here because you're a Democrat.
I love Don Trump. A lot of people don't. And I think it's not his personality. He's a man that has given his life for his country, if you think about it. And that's why I love him. But the biggest challenge is getting that sort of a message across of who he really is.
In my opinion, if you voted for Trump, then you're taking on all of the things that he and his supporters are for, and I think you're racist, and I don't want to be involved in that.
Sometimes to speak to an atheist or a person that's not conservative, have the same beliefs as me, a person of a different color, it's sometimes I want to talk to them, but I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you. Right now, I kind of feel afraid to open my mouth.
I'm afraid that if this vitriol and this animosity continues to grow, it might give certain groups a blanket check to touch upon violence.
There are nice people who do nice things. And I don't know how we get back to that.
What you just saw were excerpts from interviews done prior to a 3-day gathering of 7 Republicans and 8 Democrats in the small Rust Belt town of Lebanon, Ohio. Their comments revealed their anxieties and concerns about their coming meeting with folks who voted differently from them. After 2.5 days of skillfully guided and very dynamic exchanges, a group statement was read by David Blankenhorn, one of the leaders of the gathering, that summarized what had taken place.
We are 15 residents of Southwest Ohio. Politically, 7 of us are conservative in our philosophy, typically voting for Republican over Democratic candidates and supportive of President Donald Trump and his administration, while 8 of us are liberal in our philosophy, typically voting for Democratic over Republican candidates and critical of President Trump and his administration. A number of us on both sides began our meeting believing that the other side could not be dealt with on the basis of rational thought. We say unanimously that our experience of talking with, rather than simply at or about each other, caused us to abandon that belief.
After the meeting was over, this is what the participants had to say about what they experienced.
The way this weekend affected me is I showed emotions I kept hidden for a long time. This is the first time I've cried in a couple years, actually. So it brought some emotions out of me that I was afraid to show.
I did end up liking them as people, and even the one that came in and was saying he's arch conservative and Trump is his guy. We joked, and it was a genuine laugh that we had with each other. And so I think talking really is not underrated.
If more people had this experience, I think maybe our country could come back together and pull together as one and learn to share and understand it's okay to have opposing ideas. It's okay to be different. We are still human. We still love one another.
It smashes a lot of the stereotype of what one group or another group is supposed to be.
And I have permission to call him my Muslim friend, okay? Because we are friends. So anyway, we're going to lay the groundwork, he and I, and we're going to lay the groundwork. And one thing that we're going to do, representing what we just came from, is he's going to attend a church with me, a Christian church, and I'm going to go visit a mosque with him. And we're going to see what each other are doing.
Nice, nice.
All right, I've got more to cover, but I would like to open it up just briefly for a couple people to make a comment about what did they see in that video? What actually did it take for them to be willing to do something different? Anyone, just shout it out.
I think it took courage for them to be willing to sit with people who think differently than you, because people grow up learning a lot of what they believe, and it can be a shock to sit with somebody and possibly think differently of what you believe, because you're opening the window of what the knowledge they have, and like maybe they are right. So I think it took a lot of courage for them to do that.
So courage. You hear my dog in the background. Sorry about that. So courage. Somebody else.
I'll say curiosity, because when you're curious, sometimes you hear a lot of things from outside, but when you can sit with somebody, you're curious to know the true story when you're hearing it from somebody else. So I would say also curiosity, because if you're curious enough, you will want to hear the truth from somebody else's, the true mouth, and not from the news or from what somebody else said. But when they sat together with them, they can actually say, oh, okay, yeah, this is not what somebody else said, or this is, the truth, or whatever. They got it to hear from themselves. So curiosity, just to see. I would be more curious to want to hear what somebody else says.
I love both of those words, courage and curiosity, because they really relate to how we're able to actually do this. And so let's go ahead and go back to sharing. And so, okay, so there are several principles that I think are related to this courage and curiosity that you guys are talking about. And, I think about these principles, and I recently co-moderated a Braver Angels workshop that was entitled Depolarizing Conversations About Race. And these principles were actually mentioned in that workshop as being important when we're having these kinds of conversations. So the first principle is actually to embrace respect, curiosity, and openness. So, hey, right there, right on the screen, curiosity, because we embrace those mindsets that actually helps us have those conversational receptiveness towards another person. Another principle is to speak from the heart. And I heard some of them talking about how they shared stories, personal experiences, their own values. And you think about when you hear a person's story, it's usually more effective than just making points or spewing facts or opinions at another person. So that's another principle to remember. Another one is that we all need to save face. None of us want to be portrayed as ignorant or as bigoted. I mean, you think about a time in maybe which you have felt stereotyped or labeled or attacked, and how that affected your ability to listen. And so those types of behaviors can cause us to actually become more defensive and hold on to our beliefs even more strongly. So we need to allow other people as well as ourselves to save face. Another principle is that it's really best to assume good intentions. I remember Dr. Gerald Driscoll in our department, and and Dr. Carol Thompson, I've heard both of them say this, is that, people really are coming from a good place. If we can believe that people are coming from a good place, it makes a lot of difference. Even though a person may hold positions that you are certain maybe might lead to bad outcomes, that doesn't mean that that person wants those bad outcomes to occur. It just may mean that they have a different perspective on how to get to something than you do. And then lastly, most of us have common values and concerns that can be unearthed in a conversation. If we can remember that, it's really helpful as we move forward into these conversations. We also, though, have to abandon some expectations. One strong one, and I will just tell you, if any of these are like, I can't abandon those, then you might not be ready might not be able to have that conversation. I have a family member whose son is at this point just very disrespectful of her, and she's not at a place yet where she would want to have that conversation, even though the relationship has been broken, and he's not either. It goes both ways. And so one expectation to abandon is that you can persuade the other person to change. A third book that I'm going to mention tonight, that's a really excellent book in terms of building on your knowledge here, is called Difficult Conversations. It's written by 3 authors from the Harvard Negotiation Project. And they say that when we set out to change someone, we're more likely to argue with and attack their story, and we're less likely to listen. And actually, that is more likely to produce many of the negative consequences that we fear. So we have to enter into these learning conversations with the goal of learning, not persuading the other person to change. Another one, and this is so difficult in the times that we're in right now, is we have to let go of the thinking that facts are going to be agreed upon and that people are going to be completely logical. It's one of the main reasons, I believe, why we're polarized today in our society. We have different sets of facts, different sets of news channels we're listening to. And we don't agree on what is true anymore. We don't trust each other on that. So we have to, if we're going to have these kind of learning conversations, we're going to have to let that go and just listen to where a person is coming from. Another expectation to avoid is that our conversation partner is going to actually match our openness. In interpersonal relationships, we often talk about the reciprocity, the norm of reciprocity for self-disclosure, where oftentimes you're going to sit down and talk to somebody, you share something, and we expect them to also share in return. Well, that happens a lot in conversations, but it might not happen. You might be really open about your thoughts and experiences, and they may be still really closed off. And so you have to let go of the expectation that both persons are going to be equally open. And then lastly, you need to let go of the expectation that having this conversation, this learning conversation, is going to fix your relationship. I wish we had a pill that we could take that would fix our relationships, but we don't. Relationship problems take time to develop, and they also take time to get better and to be made better. So let's look at some skills specifically that can help us if we're willing to engage in this learning conversation with another person versus try to demonize them. I like this image because it's kind of like, I don't know if I want to be in the middle of those two mediating that conflict. I might get squished, but maybe I can get outside of the conflict and actually have that kind of conversation. So I've divided these into listening skills, speaking skills. I recognize that the two overlap. You'll see some in which, oh, that could be a speaking skill. Oh, yeah, that could be a listening skill. Well, that's because we're constantly, when we're in conversations, in this process of having dialogue, and it involves listening and speaking. We can't really divide them up that simple. But in terms of behaviors that you might be able to take with you, a takeaway, you might want to have some of these that you actually try. So remember, we're talking about learning conversations. The goal is to better understand the other person. We're trying to build conversational receptiveness. So one of the things happens before we ever enter into that conversation. It can also happen during the conversation and after the conversation. And that's our self-talk. What are we saying about the other person? I mean, this can happen even in our family when I'm having dialogue with, having a difficult conversation with my husband or with my children, my daughters. I can anticipate all the things, all the problems. I can anticipate that this is going to go badly, and that will make me even not want to be in that conversation. Or I can anticipate it could go well, and that can make me want to run towards it. But what we're saying to ourselves about the situation, about the other person, about our own identity, that happens before the conversation. It also happens after the conversation, and it can happen during the conversation. So sometimes we have to be mindful about that kind of voice that's taking place all those times during the conversation. Then open hands, and I'll attribute this. I use this all of the time. Dr. Julian Miraval, who I think is on this call, I wrote the book called The Art of Positive Communication. I actually shared this with a group. I don't know if he remembers sharing this, but he talked about that when he's in a difficult conversation, he will literally do something physical. So opening up his hands in front of him. And so you don't want to do that where the other person can necessarily see it, but that, when I'm angry at somebody, this is what I get. I can feel that I want to fight or I want to run away. Okay, that fight or flight syndrome. But if I can just lessen this, open up my hands. So I was in a conversation with a student, not a student in my class, but a student from that was having a complaint about something going on at UA Little Rock. Imagine that anybody would ever come into my office and talk about that. And they were getting very irritated and emotionally were just almost like shouting in my office. Other people were around to hear this. So anyway, I made an effort. I was behind my desk and I made an effort to open up my hands because I was feeling myself get defensive. So I opened up my hands underneath my desk, and all of a sudden I was able to listen and remember my goal here is to learn, not to try to say that their argument's bad, not to try to shoot them down in terms of their arguments, but to really learn. Then maybe if I could show that I was learning and do this next thing, which was to paraphrase, maybe they would feel heard and we could come up with a possible solution to the issue that they came into my office with, which we were able to do. Because I had open hands and I paraphrased. I checked for understanding. People sometimes don't like to paraphrase, just repeat back in your own words what the other person is saying because they think it means that you're agreeing. But you can say something like, I hear that, or it sounds to me like this, or, listening to you makes me think of, I'm wondering if you're feeling this way. Sometimes we can reflect back feelings. Amanda Ripley in her high conflict book says this: listening and checking for understanding is probably the single best way to keep conflict healthy all through life. I'm going to read that again because I think it's so simple, but it's so profound. Listening and checking for understanding is probably the single best way to keep conflict healthy all through life. So the things we're talking about, very important. A last strategy is to ask questions. Now, this one's very difficult, and I put the word genuine there because it's really got to come out of what Katrina was saying earlier, that curiosity. Okay, the questions that we can ask can come across as being gotcha questions. They can come across as being cross-examining questions, like if you were on the stand and a lawyer was across from you. Remember, your goal is to learn and understand, not to change the person's opinion, not to poke holes in it, but to truly ask, how did they come up with that belief, or what was their actual experience that led to that? So Amanda Ripley, and I quote from her a lot because it's truly the best book that I've read in the last year, her book on high conflict. She says, one fundamental lesson for anyone who wants to cultivate healthy conflict is to complicate the narrative early and often. Complicate the narrative. That means that we don't just assume the story that we're telling is the only story. We realize that there is another story, their story. And as the Difficult Conversations author talk about, there's a third story. That's if we were to go to the balcony above all of everything that's happening, and we go to the balcony and we say, what else could be happening? William Ury is an example that Amanda Ripley uses in the book. And she talks about, in this example, William Ury was meeting with Chavez from another country there. He was doing some work and trying to help them deal with some global conflict issues. And the guy was like 3 hours late in the first place. And then when he comes into the meeting, Chavez, he got in really close to William Ury's face and he yelled at him for 30 minutes. Now, I don't know what that's like for you, but having somebody yell at me would be very, very difficult. I would have really had to practice those open hands underneath the table. Well, Ury imagined himself, as this guy was talking, being on a balcony and observing this from an alternate neutral third party standpoint, so a third party standpoint that wasn't his point of view, wasn't Chavez's point of view. And he was able to actually see it and see what that person was saying. And at the end of the 30 minutes, the guy had vented and he's like, okay, now I'm ready to help solve the problem. No idea that he was going to do that within that 30 minutes. But it's these kinds of listening skills that help us to start opening up the channels where we might be able to actually have those kind of learning conversations. All right. There's also some speaking skills. One of the things that I think is helpful whenever we're thinking about talking to someone is this goes back to that story, the restorying part, or seeing the third story, the additional stories, is we have to acknowledge their viewpoint. And I put POV there, point of view, acknowledging their point of view. So that may mean we just say, well, paraphrasing, it sounds like this, or I hear you saying this, or it sounds like this is important to you. Where they feel heard. Okay, that sounds like a listening skill, but it's also something we say with our words. So I put it under speaking skills to emphasize it again. Another thing is to ask permission to share your ideas. This doesn't seem like something we would need to do, but I think, especially if you're going to share a different perspective, it's helpful to say, okay, it sounds like this. I hear that perspective. I'm actually coming from a different perspective. I've done some reading on this. Would you be willing to hear another idea, another perspective? And they truly may say, no way, I'm not going to do that. And that's fine. I actually suggested this to a family member recently who was going to try this with her daughter. And she's like, I need to have this conversation with her. I said, do you know if she wants to have the conversation? She said, no. I said, well, maybe you should ask her if you can share your ideas. Now, she did ask her, and her daughter said, no, Mom, I know what you believe and think. I don't want to hear this. And so this family member never did get to share the ideas. So we have to be willing that might actually happen. But sometimes people will say, well, sure, I've shared my perspective. You can share yours. Okay. If they do allow you to do that, then use I language. Take responsibility for yourself. I think about the times when I get upset and I'm getting, blaming somebody else, and I use you language. It's almost always, I can just feel my finger come out in front of me. You dirty rascal, you. Okay. And if that's pointing the finger at, nobody likes to have that. We all like to save face. So if I can say, well, I don't know, but maybe this, I'm thinking this is just my perspective. It's my, I can't say it's everybody's perspective on my side, but that I language is much, much more well received. And then share life experiences. It's so much better to tell a story than to spew facts. We already mentioned that earlier. Remember, your goal here is not to win. This is not a conversation about winning. This is a conversation about trying to understand the other person. All right, as we move to thinking about these conversations, there's some caveats that you need to consider. Obviously, carefully, not only who the person is that you're talking to, but carefully choose the time and the place. I told my class this week that I had a conversation with my daughter. I chose to have a conversation at 11 o'clock at night. It was a difficult dialogue. That was not a good time to have the conversation, especially after she had just been fired from her job that day. And it wasn't about being fired from the job that I had the conversation. I don't know what possessed me to go in there. The next day I was able to apologize. But anyways, she, you have to choose the time and the place carefully. And also I would say choose the person carefully. Don't start with the most extreme person on the other side. Start with somebody that you might have just found out voted for somebody different than you, or holds a different opinion than you, but you're a friend with them. Focus initially on one-to-one conversations as opposed to groups or online conversations. We know that Facebook conversations do not go well. Group conversations can feel like people are being ganged up on. Prepare to feel uncomfortable. Dr. Kristen McIntyre talks about discomfort being the place of growth. All right. We will never grow if we are not embracing and leaning into the suck. That's Brene Brown's term, actually. Leaning into the suck, the uncomfortableness of what it is to actually be in a conversation that we don't have all the answers, that we're trying to learn from another person. And then lastly, consider your purpose. Is your purpose to advocate, or is it to understand? There's a place and a time for both, but these learning conversations are to be understanding, not to be advocating. So if your purpose is to persuade, pause. Most likely, this isn't the kind of conversation you need to be having, but if your purpose is to understand, then you can continue. So in short, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about polarization. We've talked about different ways of kind of dealing with it. But what I want you to leave with tonight, along with some strategies, is to remember that there is hope. I believe there is hope, one relationship at a time. I'm going to go back and quote from Robert Staines's article, Repairing the Breach, that 2014 article that I mentioned earlier. Dialogue holds the purpose of healing in contexts in which community is broken. The sense of community depends on our quality of relationships, and relationships grow from our conversations. Therefore, the quality of our conversations drive the quality of relationships and the possibility of community. He also says, I think I've got this on here. Yes, hope for relationship and community healing comes when dialogue focuses on personal stories, emotions, and identities. It can counter the effects of the stories told of others that shred relational and communal bonds, and the emotions that inflame or imprison. One more quote from Staines. I love this quote. Healing dialogue invites people to stand in a place of honor in the identities that matter most to them and that they feel have been maligned. You know, there was a cultural exchange program that Amanda Ripley talks about in her High Conflict book. And there were progressive Jewish New Yorkers and conservative Christians from Michigan that came together and actually stayed in each other's homes for 3 days over a period of time. And this one of the quotes from that book was actually the Amanda Ripley talking about one of the Jewish progressive Jewish New Yorkers. She said, when I last talked to Martha, she said she often wondered what Caleb, and that was one of the conservative Christians from Michigan. She says, she often wondered what Caleb might be thinking. She thought of him whenever she read the news about the coronavirus spreading in prisons or about protests in Michigan, because Caleb worked in a prison. She says, how is Caleb seeing all of this? She'd ask herself. She knew she probably wouldn't like the answers, but she didn't assume anymore that she knew what the answers were. And that was huge. She'd set that false confidence aside. She was still curious 2 years later. She said, I felt like this brought out the best of me. And I knew exactly what she meant, the author says. I've had the same feeling, a sense of being fully alive in good conflict, arguing, wondering, revising, awakening to something I hadn't understood before without surrendering what I held dear. Since once you've had that sensation, you want to feel it again, that sense of wonder that comes from discovering our common humanity in good conflict. But in normal life, these opportunities are becoming vanishingly rare. So what do? Some action steps that you can take. Identify some low-hanging fruit, some opportunities, some relationships in which you could practice conversational receptiveness. Try these skills out in a safe space. Go to braverangels.org, just one place, and look at what do we do, and look up the one-to-one conversation guides that you could actually use with people who are different from you. Guided conversations in which the listening and paraphrasing is actually built in. Read more on how to have difficult conversations. I've mentioned 2 books tonight that are really practical. The Difficult Conversations book I mentioned from the Harvard Negotiation Project authors, and High Conflict from Amanda Ripley. Both books really excellent. So, as we, in summary tonight, we've looked at the problem of polarization. We've looked at some communication strategies for confronting it within ourselves and our relationships. And when we think about civil dialogue, we need to remember that civility is not just about being polite. It's actually about holding the space for our disagreements while we create and maintain ethical communication practices like we've talked about tonight, which value the worth of another person. And it's also being willing to interrupt narratives, which can lead to these high conflicts. We've only had time to talk about the first part of this tonight. When practicing the types of things that we've talked about here, we can build both our conversational resilience, our conflict resilience, and our conversational receptiveness. I'm going to end with a quote from Martha, who contributed in that cultural exchange program that I mentioned from Amanda Ripley's High Conflict book. She said, I wish I could appear everywhere in my life the way I felt called to appear those 2 times. Present, open, and able to be surprised. Those 3 words. Present, I'm really listening. Open, that courage to be open, to do the things we're talking about. And the curiosity, that ability to be surprised. All right, I have talked long enough. It is time now for you to have a chance to ask questions. And Bailey, I think there may be some questions in the chat.
Yes.
I'm actually, so why don't you read some of them, and then we might have some time for live questions too, if people can stay on a little bit longer.
Absolutely. And feel free to contribute them still in the chat if you prefer that medium as well. So the first question, Morgan asked, how does this polarization relate to uncertainty or uncertainty reduction theory?
All right. Uncertainty reduction theory is a theory that's used to try to describe how it is that we manage that discomfort that we're feeling inside when we don't know how the other person's going to react. Okay, so it's that uncertainty. We have uncertainty when we're anticipating conversations. We have uncertainty sometimes when we ended a conversation and have no idea how well that went and how the people are actually, I had uncertainty when I had that conversation with my daughter and knew that she's going to sleep, I'm going to sleep, and I can't fix this tonight. Okay, so when we think about the uncertainty reduction theory, we try to do things like we try to oftentimes observe from a distance the people, okay, that are that we might not know very well, or we try to talk to people who know those people, or we try to actually interact with them. And so it really relates a lot to this, Morgan, because if you really follow the principles of uncertainty reduction theory, it talks about that in order to really reduce uncertainty, we have to get to know the person. We have to actually talk to them, ask questions. We have to view them as a human being. So I don't think it really talks about the humanity of the person, but that certainly relates to depolarizing. The more I can get to know people. I have met so many people over the United States this last 2 years of being part of this national organization, Braver Angels, that I would never have ever had conversations with them about. We don't talk about politics. We talk about the work that we're doing together, even though we're on different sides of the political aisle. I could probably get into an argument with them. But that's not what I desire. I want to value them as human beings so that we can help come together and solve some of the issues in our society together. Bailey, what's next?
The second question comes from Dr. Driscoll, and he asked, is there a place to engage in dialogue on the question about how we determine what is true and what is to be trusted? Yeah. So suggestions for engaging in dialogue on those topics.
Yeah. Absolutely. In fact, and I'm sorry, I keep just mentioning Braver Angels. This is not a sales pitch for them, but it is where I know what is happening a little bit more. They actually had a debate in the last few months in which they talked about whose facts are correct. And it was interesting because what ended up coming out in that debate was not an argument about your facts are correct or my facts are correct, but was about how people got to the place of believing that certain facts were correct, or got to the place of going towards certain outlets to get their information. And so all of a sudden you left that with saying, okay, I do not agree with where they're going. I don't agree with their logic. I don't agree with the facts that they're actually doing, but I know how they got there. And I understand their life experiences that actually led them to go there. And so now I have empathy. All right. So if I'm in a conversation in which maybe I'm not having that kind of debate, it's not set up that way, but I'm having a conversation and I'll just say it with a family member. I'm trying not to call out the persons in my family in case they might ever listen to this. They will know who they are if they do listen to it. But if I had a conversation about, we'll just take COVID right now and mask. One of my family members doesn't think masks are necessary. I think masks are necessary. All right. So I want to find out. So tell me, where are you gathering your information? Not so I can point holes in it. I want to learn who she's listening to. I want to learn. And you know what? There may be some flaws in some of the science. maybe there are some things that I need to be looking at differently. Oh gosh, I don't even want to consider that. But so she points me to an article that talks about different types of masks and how you wear them. And so we can't just assume all masks are created equal. Well, you know what? I agree with that. So we ended up finding out that even though on the surface, the things that she's posting on social media are things that cause me to snooze her because I don't want to hear it, are actually some of which I might, if I dug deep enough, I might actually agree with. And so that's the, where we're having that kind of conversation. Now, is there ever a time in which I should be questioning your facts and I should be advocating that you are absolutely wrong? I think there is that time for advocacy. There is the time for speaking up, for having that strong civility that would be doing that. But I don't think the person's going to hear me unless I'm in relationship with them. I'll just leave that there.
The next question comes from Daniel, and he asked, oftentimes today we are not able to have these types of important conversations in person or even over video. What are some best practices to implement these strategies when we are restricted to text alone?
Yeah. Daniel, what a great question. When I think about that with COVID, especially, in some ways, it used to be in communication classes, we would talk about, our conversations are different over the phone than they are in person. And then we would move to our conversations are different over text than they are in person. Well, now our conversations are so asynchronous. And what I mean by asynchronous means that we are not having the conversation in real time together. And what happens with those asynchronous conversations is that oftentimes they're happening in social media circles where people are lobbying things that people that they don't even know. So first of all, I would avoid having the conversation in that kind of place where other people, where you can't actually get to understand what the purpose of the conversation is. Okay. So secondly is I would try to create a space for a synchronous conversation, whether it be social distance or by phone or by Zoom or by FaceTime. And I would tell them what I'm really wanting, that what my purpose here is not to try to persuade, not for us to win the argument, but to try to understand. I really value you as a person. I really want to try to understand. Now, if they're a stranger, then you don't necessarily are able to do that. So I think about the one-to-one conversations that Braver Angels sets up, and sometimes you can just sign up for those and you'll get paired with somebody that's a stranger to you. Well, they built it where you actually share, why did you come to this conversation? So all of a sudden you're both kind of realizing and talking about the purpose. So I think it's really important, first of all, to see if you can come to some place with that synchronous, that you can also share ahead of time, what is the purpose and what, that they can see and hear your tone of voice and actually say, I would like to have this conversation and here's why.
Those are all of our texted content questions, but if anyone has an additional question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it out loud. And I actually have one.
Oh boy.
If that works.
Yes.
You've slightly alluded to this as well. Typically avoidance is considered a dysfunctional conflict style, but how might it be used constructively or to promote civil dialogue in regards to politics?
Yeah. Actually, I think avoidance is a really key tool. A couple of times that I would just say in terms of avoiding. One is when you are being flooded. John Gottman talks about what happens when we get flooded by emotions. He's actually in his laboratory, hooks people up to blood pressure monitors and oxygen monitors, and just things happen in our body when we are like that. And when I am feeling that flooded, I tend to become really defensive. I might stonewall and absolutely can't have that conversation. And so I try to reschedule if I'm thinking straight. Now, I don't always do this. Okay. Sometimes you can't. The person sitting down in your office and you're like, well, I'm feeling flooded. I can feel it. So that's when I have the open hands. But if I'm in a relationship with my kids, this is where it happens. My teenagers more often than not is I'll just say, okay, I can't have this conversation right now. I need to walk away, and I go for a walk. And so now I will say that some people who are avoiders early on in my marriage, my husband and I realized we had very different conflict styles. And he was an avoider that would never deal with the conflict. And so I was an exploder. I was like a volcano. And so I had to deal with it. I felt like right then. And so we had a conflict over how we had conflict until we learned that if we could schedule the discussion. So I'm feeling exploding. I've got to talk about this right now, which is kind of what was happening with me at 11 o'clock last week. Okay, I've got to talk about this right now. If I would have recognized that and would have just said, okay, let's breathe, some deep breaths. Let's get my autonomic system just to slow down and think about what's the time and place, and then make a time to talk about it. And so he had to end up having to do that with me. He'd say, I can see that you're very hyped up and irritated. At this point, I can't think straight with the emotions that are going on, and nothing against you, but can we talk about this Friday night? We'll make a time on Friday night to talk about it. And so we would have our Friday night times in which this is for 4 kids, in which we would have these kind of conversations, which we just know this is when it's going to happen. So avoidance was temporary at that point. Okay. But there are going to be times in your life that avoidance needs to be a boundary that you set to take care of yourself. All right. And so, and that's what some people would call a hard stop in a conversation. The person is attacking you, making fun of your values. They are anything that you do, open hands, nothing. And you just realize the costs and rewards here of staying in this conversation are probably, the costs are going to be too high than the rewards. And you can just say something like, I'm feeling attacked here. I don't feel like this is a fair conversation, and I need to leave now. But you're acknowledging it. You're not just avoiding and saying, and never having it. You're actually trying to engage, but realizing there's a point at which this is where the boundaries got to be set. And I've seen students talk about this with parents, for example, and how they just had to set really strong boundaries with people who are dysfunctional in their lives. And you may never, ever have a friendship with that person or have a relationship that you can have this kind of learning conversation. I don't think it's possible to have it with everybody. I don't. I think, though, that we can have it more often than we realize. And so that's why I'm challenging with the information tonight. Other questions?
There is one last disclosure in the chat from Sharon, who is really talking about how, in the past, particularly a family member made, attacked, cursed, threatened. A year has passed, and now the family wants to really work it out and get together, but there hasn't been an apology issued. So other than boundaries, what suggestions might you have for that situation?
So, one of the things that I had to do with my mom before she passed away is I had to get to the point where I had to be okay with the fact that she would never apologize. Never. It wasn't culturally and the norm. But I also would say to her when I was in conversations with her, Mom, I do not want your advice on this. I just want to share so that you could be part of my life, share what's going on in my life, but I do not want your advice. And, we were able to somehow come to that kind of change in our relationship dynamics in the last few months of her life to be able to maintain a relationship. But in this case, Sharon, that's such a difficult thing. And it's family. I mean, it's like, so you have to weigh again those costs and benefits of whether you want to be doing this. I would recommend, if there's anybody at all that's neutral in the family, that both parties, you almost need a mediator at times, but you may have to go into it realizing you're never going to get the apology. Just their willingness to be in the conversation might be all they can do to apologize. And you have to be, okay, am I going to be okay with that? Am I not? There is a Braver Angels new workshop that has just come out that I would highly recommend for any of you who are dreading those kinds of upcoming conversations or might have the opportunity. It's called Family and Politics. And if you would go into braverangels.org and actually look at events, upcoming events, you'll see, and you can attend because it's over Zoom, things that are offered all over the country. You just have to watch the time zone kind of issue. But it has some pretty good techniques for how to deal with, and he talks, Bill Doherty, who developed the materials, talks about 5 or 6 different roles that we get into in our families that, and then it goes into basically how do we deal with each one of those roles. You have to identify kind of which role you play, but also when the other people are coming together. He also talks about that it's very difficult to have these kinds of conversations as a group because there tend to be the ins and the outs of the family. And you could feel really ganged up on if you're in the out side of that family. So.
It looks like we have another question from Ashley in relation to the avoidance question. You talked about snoozing connections on Facebook, and I do know a lot of people, maybe myself included, who have unfollowed people for political rhetoric over the past year or so. Do you think this either helps or hinders these intentional conversations, or maybe contributes to making these conversations more difficult?
If they know that you've snoozed them and they care, then yes, it could make it more difficult. I actually have had a conversation though with this person that I've snoozed and told her why, and she says she doesn't care. I think she feels more free actually to post all this stuff if I'm not listening. I can't say the same for my husband or daughter who do respond though to this family member's post, who get really irritated. But here's the thing, I have to protect my own well-being and sanity, and I will either have to get off of Facebook and not read those things at all in order to have a relationship that I think is valuable to have with this person, or I can snooze her. Now, with that said, I make a really an attempt to keep friends on both sides of the political aisle on my Facebook feed. Why do I do that? It's because I want to get out of my echo chambers. If I'm only Facebook, the algorithms, the more you like something, the more you're going to get posts like that. The more you dislike something, the more you're going to not get posts like that. So if all I'm ever seeing is my side, I've snoozed everybody else, then I don't even have any idea of what the other side looks like. So it's so much easier to stereotype them because all I'm getting now is from the media. So one of the ways of doing this also is to subscribe to allsides.com. It's one word, allsides.com, that actually take news stories and look at it from the left, the center, and the right, so that you can start seeing some possible other ways of viewing things. But I try to make an effort. In fact, my students saw this recently, in which I brought in 2 example posts from 2 people, one that was ultra conservative and one that was ultra liberal. I knew them both. I actually had dated one of them in the past, and one of them was a colleague professor at another university. Okay. Hadn't dated him, but anyway, and they were both just so extreme and ridiculing the other side that I thought it was a great example to use as an illustration. Well, if I didn't follow them, I wouldn't even know that there were that kind of language that's out there. It also helped me realize what kind of language I use when I'm in polarized settings with my own group. So yeah. Other questions?
I think that is all.
All right. Well, I am so grateful that you all came tonight. I know this is not a topic that we maybe like to think about. It brings us discomfort when we're thinking about our own families, and we're thinking about relationships maybe that we have completely cut off because of this. And I'm hoping that there's at least one thing that you've taken with you. So I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I would like for you in the chat to put down one thing. This gives me feedback, okay? one thing that you think that you are going to be taking with you from tonight's session. Okay. So just one thing that you're taking with you. I'm going to tell you what my thing would be that I'm taking with me tonight. And I'm taking with me courage and curiosity, the two things that were shared earlier tonight from a couple of your colleagues. This work takes courage. This work requires curiosity. All right, so I'm just seeing some of the things that are coming in. We have hope. We have listening and communication skills, being present, open, and able to be surprised, open hands during heated conversations, echo chamber, attribution. Oh, that's right, Morgan, you're doing your whole research master's project on this topic. What to abandon when being curious and open, getting out of the echo chambers, importance of language and sense making, allsides.com, not to give up on a current relationship, trying to make relationships more meaningful and avoid future conflict, approach differences with learning mindset. I like, this is Brandon, thank you. I'm taking with me the practice of releasing myself from stories that I may tell myself that pain the other as other. Wow, isn't that powerful? The stories that to recognize the stories that we're telling ourselves about others that are paining them. Read more. Yeah, actually, I will put in the chat the 3 books that I referenced tonight. And I got them all on Amazon, but I'm sure local bookstores would have them if you prefer shopping locally as well. Okay, so keep writing your takeaway while I'm doing that. And these are 3 different books. The last one is a much more academic view of civility and civil dialogue. Conflict resilience being built like muscles. Okay. Well, this is awesome. I think it is time. We have taken up more time than maybe what some of you expected to have. We had some technical difficulty at the beginning, but thank you so much for coming. We will have a recording actually that we will be sharing to all the people that signed up. So we will share that with you, and we'll also be following up if you have any questions. I will put my email address also in the chat. So if you would like to follow up with me directly, you can also email me. So good night. Oh, I think we were going to take a picture, weren't we, Bailey or Kristen? So if we can unspotlight me,
Yes, we were.
quit recording and unspotlight me.